There are moments in history that no one plans. No one schedules them into a calendar. No one writes them into an official report. They simply happen in the cold gray light of an unremarkable morning at a gate that hundreds of people pass through every day without a second thought. And yet somehow, these unplanned moments become the ones that define what a human being is truly made of. This is one of those moments. The year's 1953. The Soviet Union is in a peculiar state of suspended breath. Stalin has just died. The country is reorganizing itself quietly like a great machine shifting gears in the dark. In Moscow and in garrisons scattered across the Soviet landscape, military life continues with the rigid mechanical precision it has always maintained. Soldiers wake before dawn, they drink their thin morning tea, they pull on their uniforms, button every button, and report for duty. The routine is absolute. The routine is sacred. It is approximately 6:45 in the morning. At a military garrison on the western outskirts of Moscow, the checkpoint post is manned by a single soldier. His name is Alexei. He's 21 years old. He's not particularly tall. He's not particularly broad-shouldered. There's nothing about his appearance that would make a stranger on the street look twice. He has a plain, open face, the kind of face you might find on 100,000 young men across the Soviet Union. A face that suggests nothing more complicated than honest labor, early mornings, and good night's sleep. He has been on duty since 5 in the morning. He will remain at his post until 9. Those are the regulations. He follows them. The morning air carries the particular bite of a Russian October, sharp, clean, slightly metallic, the kind of cold that makes your nose run and your fingers stiffen inside your gloves if you stand still too long. Alexei does not stand still. He moves in the prescribed patrol pattern, 3 steps left, 3 steps right, eyes on the approach road, eyes on the perimeter, eyes on the gate. He does this not because someone is watching him. He does this because that is what the regulations specify. And to Alexei, the regulations are not a burden. They are, in the most literal sense, the architecture of the world he inhabits. They are the load-bearing walls of his existence. The road leading to the garrison checkpoint stretches about 400 meters before it curves around a stand of birch trees and disappears. At this hour, it's empty. It is almost always empty at this hour. The heavy traffic, supply trucks, officer vehicles, administrative convoys, doesn't begin until after 7:30. Alexei knows this. He has memorized the rhythms of this road the way a fisherman memorizes the rhythms of a river. At approximately 6:52 in the morning, something changes. A sound first, the low, unmistakable purr of powerful engines. Not one engine, multiple engines working in coordinated sequence, the sound of a column rather than a single vehicle. Alexei's head turns toward the birch trees. He does not break his patrol pattern, not yet, but his eyes sharpen. His hand, almost unconsciously, moves to the position of readiness near his side. The first vehicle emerges from behind the birch trees. It is a ZS-110, a long, dark, imposing automobile, the kind of car that does not belong to ordinary people. Behind it, a second vehicle of the same model. Behind that, a third. The convoy is moving at a pace that suggests urgency or importance, or both. The vehicles are polished to a mirror finish despite the early hour and the autumn mud on the road. Their windows are darkened. Alexei watches them approach. He feels something he will later describe, in the few times he tells his story, as a kind of ringing in the chest. Not fear exactly, but heightened awareness, the way your entire body seems to become more present, more alert, when something shifts from ordinary to significant. The lead vehicle slows as it reaches the checkpoint barrier. Alexei steps forward. He positions himself exactly as regulations specify. Straight posture, direct eye contact with the vehicle, one hand raised in the standard halt signal. His voice when he speaks carries the flat, neutral authority that every checkpoint soldier is trained to project regardless of who or what stands before him. Stop. Present your documents. The lead vehicle comes to a full halt. Its engine idles. For a moment, nothing happens. The 2 vehicles behind it also stop. The convoy freezes in place like a tableau, engines murmuring in the morning quiet. Then the window of the lead vehicle begins to descend. Later, historians who have studied this period will note that Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the most decorated military commander in Soviet history, the man who signed the German surrender document in Berlin, the man whose name was synonymous with Soviet military power, had a habit of conducting early morning inspection tours of garrisons. He believed, reportedly, that you could learn more about a military installation in the first hour of the morning than in an entire day of formal review. The men were less rehearsed. The machinery of daily routine was visible in its raw, unrehearsed form. On this particular morning, Zhukov had decided to inspect a garrison. He had not announced his visit in advance. The window descends fully, and Alexei, 21 years old, plain-faced, regulation-minded, standing at his post as he has been trained to do. Alexei looks directly into the window and sees a face he recognizes immediately. Not from personal acquaintance, no. He recognizes this face the way every Soviet soldier recognizes it. From photographs in newspapers, from portraits on walls, from the pages of military history textbooks, the broad forehead, the heavy square jaw, the eyes, steady, measuring, entirely accustomed to being obeyed. The 4 gold stars of a hero of the Soviet Union gleam on the chest of the man sitting in the back seat. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Minister of Defense of the USSR, looks at Alexei. Alexei looks back at him. 1 second passes, 2 seconds. The birch trees stand motionless in the cold morning air. The engines of 3 black automobiles idle softly. Inside the garrison, life goes on as normal. Soldiers eating breakfast, officers reviewing the day's schedules, a dog somewhere barking at a passing truck. The world, enormous and indifferent, rotates on its axis. Here at this gate, the world is stopped. There is a regulation. It is not a complicated regulation, not a subtle one, not one open to interpretation. It states clearly and without qualification that no vehicle may pass through a military checkpoint without the presentation of proper identification documents, regardless of rank, regardless of position, regardless of any external indicator of authority, including, explicitly, the insignia of rank worn on a uniform. The regulation does not say, except when the person is very important. The regulation does not say, unless you recognize the face. The regulation does not say, use your judgment about who deserves to be checked. The regulation says, no one passes without documents. No one. Alexei knows this regulation. He has read it. He has memorized it. He has, in quiet moments, on previous shifts, turned it over in his mind the way you might turn over a philosophical proposition, examining it from different angles, testing its logic, and every time he has arrived at the same conclusion. The rule exists precisely because it must apply to everyone. The moment it applies to everyone except certain people, it stops being a rule. It becomes a suggestion, and suggestions in matters of military security are worse than useless. The marshal is waiting. His face is unreadable. He has been in this position, the position of supreme authority, the position where other men flinch and step aside, for decades. He knows without any doubt that the young soldier in front of him knows exactly who he is. He knows the soldier recognized him the moment the window came down. He waits to see what the soldier will do. Alexei takes one breath, then another. He straightens to his full height. His voice is steady. It does not shake. It does not apologize. It does not explain itself beyond what is strictly necessary. Comrade Marshal, Alexei says, I am required to ask for your documents. The morning air is absolutely still, and somewhere in the depths of that silence, somewhere in the space between a soldier's words and a marshal's response, the entire weight of the Soviet Union seems to hang, suspended, waiting to fall. What happens next will determine everything. Before we go any further, before we return to that checkpoint, to those 3 black automobiles idling in the morning cold, to the marshal's unreadable face and the soldier's steady voice, we need to understand something. We need to understand who Alexei actually was, because the action of a person only makes sense when you know the life that formed them. And the life that formed Alexei was not extraordinary by any standard measure. It was, in almost every respect, exactly ordinary. And that is precisely the point. History does not only remember the generals, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, it pauses long enough to notice the private standing at the gate. The village of Ticino sits approximately 300 kilometers southeast of Moscow, in the Ryazan Oblast. If you were to look for it on a map today, you would find it with difficulty. A small cluster of houses along a dirt road that turns to mud every spring and freezes solid every November. In the 1930s and 40s, it was the kind of place where the 20th century arrived late and left early. There was one school, one general store, one wooden church that had been repurposed as a grain storage facility after the Revolution, its bell tower still standing stripped and silent, like a man who has forgotten how to speak. Alexei Petrov was born there in 1932. His father, Nikolai Petrov, was a man of the land in the oldest possible sense. Not poetic about it, not sentimental, simply rooted in it the way a tree is rooted, without drama or declaration. He had fought in the Great Patriotic War and returned with a wound in his left shoulder that never fully healed and a silence that his family learned to read the way sailors read weather. He did not speak often about the war. When he did, it was in short, factual sentences, like a man filing a report. But there was one thing Nikolai Petrov did speak about repeatedly without variation, the matter of a man's word. Your word is the only thing you own completely, he would say, sitting at the wooden table after dinner, rolling his tobacco with methodical patience. Everything else, land, health, money, reputation, life can take those. But your word is yours, until you give it away. Alexei's mother, Vera, was a quieter kind of strength. She taught at the village school, mathematics and Russian language, in a building that smelled of chalk dust and damp wool and the particular sweetness of children who have been running outdoors in cold air. She believed, with a schoolteacher's disciplined conviction, that the rules of grammar existed for a reason, that the rules of arithmetic existed for a reason, and that, by extension, the rules of human conduct existed for a reason. Not arbitrary reasons, structural ones. The rules held the whole thing together. These were the parents who raised Alexei. He grew up understanding at a level below conscious thought that the world had an architecture, that this architecture had been built slowly by generations of people who understood that some things must be consistent in order to mean anything at all. He was not a rigid child. His neighbors and former teachers, in the few accounts that survive, describe him as warm, even playful, with a quick laugh and a genuine interest in other people. But beneath the warmth, there was something firm, something that did not bend. In school, he was not the top student. He was not particularly gifted at the subjects that announced themselves early. Mathematics came hard to him. He struggled with formal written composition. What he was, consistently and without exception across every year of his schooling, was reliable. He did what he said he would do. He showed up when he said he would show up. He finished what he started. His teachers noted this in the way that teachers notice qualities that don't fit neatly into grades. One of his primary school teachers, a woman named Galina Ivanovna, in an account later recorded by a regional journalist in the 1980s, remembered young Alexei with a specific story. The class had been assigned to water the school garden plot every morning for 1 week while the regular caretaker was ill. On the third day, it rained heavily overnight. Every other student, logically and reasonably, decided that the garden had been watered by nature and that their presence was therefore unnecessary. Alexei appeared at the school plot at 6 a.m. in the rain to check whether the rain had actually been sufficient. He determined that the far corner of the plot, shielded by the overhang of the building, had received less water than the rest. He watered it. No one saw him do this. No one rewarded him for it. He did not mention it to anyone. When Galina Ivanovna arrived and found him leaving, she asked why he had come. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "We said we would water the garden every morning this week," he told her. "It's morning. It's this week." That was Alexei. In 1951, when Alexei was 18 years old, the Soviet Army came to Ticino in the form of a conscription notice. This was neither a surprise nor a cause for alarm. Every young man in the village expected it. The Army was a fact of life in the way that harvest season was a fact of life, the way winter was a fact of life. You prepared for it. You went. The evening before Alexei's departure, his father sat with him on the front steps of their house. The sky was the deep, saturated blue of a late summer evening in central Russia. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor moved across a field. They sat without speaking for a long time, which was not unusual between them. They had always been comfortable in silence, the kind of comfort that only develops between people who trust each other completely. Finally, Alexei Petrov said 2 words. Just 2 words in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had already decided that everything worth saying could be condensed into the smallest possible space. Sluzi chestno. Serve honestly, not serve bravely, not serve and come back safely, not even make us proud. Simply, serve honestly, as if honesty were not a quality among qualities, but the quality, the single organizing principle beneath which everything else was arranged. Alexei looked at his father. He nodded once. Then they sat together till the sky turned dark. He would carry those 2 words for the rest of his life, the way some men carry a compass, not consulting it constantly, but knowing it was there, knowing that when the terrain became unfamiliar and the landmarks disappeared, he could reach for it, and it would tell him which direction was true north. Military service, when Alexei encountered it, did not disappoint him. This distinguished him immediately and noticeably from the majority of his fellow conscripts. Most young men from villages like Ticino arrived at their garrisons with a complicated mixture of excitement and resentment. Excited by the novelty, resentful of the discipline, performing obedience as a temporary accommodation rather than embracing it as a genuine value. They followed the regulations when someone was watching. They softened the regulations when no one was. This was not cynicism exactly. It was simply the pragmatic flexibility that most human beings apply to the rules of institutions they have been assigned to rather than chosen. Alexei was different. He read the military regulations the way his mother had taught him to read a grammar textbook, not as a list of restrictions, but as a system of logic, each rule existing in relation to all the others, the whole structure making sense only when every part was treated as genuinely binding. He was not, his fellow soldiers would later recall, preachy about this. He did not lecture. He did not report others for minor infractions. He simply, quietly, absolutely held himself to the full standard of what the regulations required. His commanding sergeant, a weathered career soldier named Stepan Mikhailovich Gruzdev, who had seen enough conscripts to have lost all capacity for surprise, noticed Alexei within the first 2 weeks of his service, not because Alexei had done anything dramatic, but because, in Gruzdev's own words, recorded decades later in a memoir that was never published but was preserved in a regional archive, he was the only one who behaved exactly the same, whether I was standing 5 meters away or 500 meters away. Some men performed discipline. He simply had it. Gruzdev assigned Alexei to checkpoint duty. This was not in the hierarchy of military assignments a prestigious posting. Checkpoint duty was considered unglamorous, repetitive, physically demanding in a dull way, socially invisible. The soldiers who stood at gates were not the ones who appeared in the garrison newspaper. They were not the ones who got mentioned in dispatches. They were the ones who stood in the cold and checked documents and opened and closed barriers and did the same thing, the same way, 100 times a day. Alexei accepted the assignment without complaint. He accepted it, in fact, with something that Gruzdev recognized with quiet satisfaction as genuine seriousness. Alexei understood with a clarity that his sergeant found both impressive and slightly unnerving exactly what a checkpoint was for. It was not a formality. It was not bureaucratic theater. It was, in the most fundamental sense, the point where the inside and the outside of a protected space met, where the integrity of that space was either maintained or compromised, every time, without exception, regardless of who was asking to be let through. If the rule has exceptions, Alexei said once to a fellow soldier who had suggested that checking the documents of obviously senior officers was a waste of everyone's time. If the rule has exceptions, then the rule doesn't exist. What exists instead is a suggestion, and a suggestion is just a polite way of saying that whoever is in charge at this moment can do whatever they want. The fellow soldier shrugged and went back to his lunch. He was not particularly interested in the philosophy of checkpoints. Alexei went back to his post. By October of 1953, and by the morning that will define this entire story, Alexei had been at the garrison checkpoint for nearly 2 years. He was 21 years old. He knew every vehicle that regularly passed through his gate. He knew the sound of each engine. He knew which officers ran late, which supply trucks arrived early, which administrative staff cut corners on their documentation and needed to be reminded, politely and without incident, to return the following day with the correct paperwork. He was not friends with the officers. He was not enemies with them. He was simply, precisely, the soldier standing at the gate, consistent, predictable, absolutely reliable. He had, in 2 years at his post, never once made an exception. Not for a lieutenant, not for a major, not for a colonel who once arrived at 6 in the morning in a state of considerable agitation, insisting that he had misplaced his identification documents, but that everyone surely knew who he was. Not for anyone. 2 words lived in him, quiet and persistent, like a compass needle always finding north. Serve honestly. On the morning of the incident, Alexei had been at his post for 1 hour and 52 minutes when the sound of engines reached him from behind the birch trees. He had drunk half a flask of tea. He had processed 3 vehicles, a supply truck, a courier motorcycle, and the garrison doctor's car. He had checked every document. He had opened and closed the gate 3 times. He was not thinking about history. He was not thinking about legacy. He was not thinking about what kind of story this morning might become decades later, told and retold across barracks and kitchen tables, and eventually set down in written form by people who were not yet born. He was thinking about his post, about the road, about the regulation, and then the first black automobile came around the bend in the birch trees, and everything else, every thought, every plan, every ordinary expectation of an ordinary morning fell completely away. Let us return to exactly where we left off. 3 black automobiles, engines idling, the morning air of October cold and still. A young soldier standing at the barrier with his hand raised and his voice already committed to a sentence he cannot take back. Comrade Marshal, I am required to ask for your documents. In the entire history of the Soviet military, and it is a history filled with extraordinary acts of courage, audacious battlefield decisions, and remarkable feats of human endurance, it is difficult to find a sentence more quietly radical than this one. Not because it was complicated, not because it was clever, because it was so completely, devastatingly simple. The soldier had said the same sentence, or a version of it, perhaps 300 times in the past 2 years, to truck drivers, to courier riders, to irritated colonels arriving late to morning briefings. The sentence was the same. The authority behind it was the same. What had changed was the face in the window. And Alexei had decided in the space of 2 heartbeats that this change did not matter. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was, at this point in his life, a man so accustomed to instant obedience that its absence registered in him less as surprise than as a kind of perceptual confusion, the way a person feels when they press a light switch and the room stays dark. He had commanded entire army groups. He had directed operations involving millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers. He had sat across tables from Stalin and Churchill and Eisenhower. When Georgy Zhukov arrived somewhere, things moved. People stepped aside. Barriers opened. He sat in the back seat of his ZIS 110 and looked at the soldier standing in front of the barrier. The soldier looked back at him. Zhukov's aide, seated to his left, leaned forward almost imperceptibly, the automatic instinct of a man preparing to intervene, to smooth things over, to explain to this young soldier in firm and rapid tones exactly who was sitting in this vehicle and why the barrier should be raised immediately. Zhukov stopped him with a single, almost imperceptible movement of his hand. A small gesture. Flat palm, slight downward pressure. Wait. Something in the marshal's face had shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Something more like attention. The way a man who's been reading a dull report suddenly comes across a sentence that doesn't match the pattern of everything before it. He reached into the interior pocket of his greatcoat and produced his identification document. He held it out through the open window. Alexei stepped forward. He took the document with both hands, the way regulations specified. He examined it carefully. He checked the photograph against the face before him. He verified the seal. He noted the date of issue, the authorization stamp, the signature. He performed every step of the document verification procedure exactly as he had been trained, with no shortcuts, no skimming, no deferential glances to signal that he already understood and was merely performing the minimum necessary formality. He finished. He returned the document. There was a brief silence. "Well," said Zhukov. "Comrade Marshal," Alexei said. His voice was level, not defiant, not apologetic, simply factual, the way a carpenter states the dimensions of a piece of wood. "Your identification document confirms your identity. However, according to garrison regulations, passage through this checkpoint also requires the presentation of identification documents from the driver of the vehicle and verbal authorization from the duty officer on duty at the garrison. I have neither of these at this time." Inside the vehicle, the aide made a sound that was not quite a word. Zhukov did not make any sound at all. He looked at the soldier for a long moment. Then he opened the car door. This is the moment that everyone who has ever heard this story remembers most vividly, not because of what was said, but because of the physical reality of it. Marshal Zhukov, Minister of Defense of the USSR, four-time hero of the Soviet Union, the man whose name was carved into the victory monuments of a dozen cities. This man stepped out of his car and walked to the barrier. He stood directly in front of Alexei. They were separated by perhaps half a meter of autumn air and an immeasurable distance of rank, history, and institutional power. Zhukov was not a small man. He had the physical presence of someone who had spent a lifetime being the most important person in any given space. Broad, solid, radiating the particular gravity of a man who has made decisions that shaped the fates of nations. Standing before him, Alexei must have appeared almost improbably slight. 21 years old, plain-faced, the kind of young man you would not look at twice on a Moscow street. Zhukov said very quietly, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, Comrade Marshal." "And you still will not raise the barrier?" "No, Comrade Marshal." The two syllables of that "no" fell into the silence with extraordinary weight, not shouted, not aggressive, just present, immovable, the way a stone wall is immovable, not because it is trying to resist you, but simply because that is what it is. Zhukov tilted his head slightly. "Your regulations require the driver's documents as well?" "Yes, Comrade Marshal, and verbal authorization from the duty officer." "And if the duty officer is not present?" "Then I am required to contact him and request that he come to the checkpoint to provide authorization in person." "And if I ordered you directly to open this gate?" Here Alexei paused, not a long pause, perhaps 2 seconds, but long enough to suggest that he was not answering reflexively, that he had genuinely considered the question and was giving it the answer it deserved. "Comrade Marshal," he said, "your rank authorizes you to give orders within the command structure above my position. But the regulations governing checkpoint procedure are not within the scope of orders that can override standing garrison protocol. Those regulations were established by the garrison command. I would require the duty officer to be present for any modification of standard procedure." In the vehicles behind the lead car, drivers and aides sat perfectly still. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The engines idled. Zhukov looked at this young man for what witnesses later described as a very long time, though in reality it was probably no more than 5 or 6 seconds. Long enough in this particular silence to feel geological. Then he spoke again. 3 times, he said, almost to himself, as though making a private observation. You have refused me 3 times. With respect, Comrade Marshal, I have not refused you. I have explained what the regulations require. The gate will open as soon as the proper procedure has been completed. That third refusal, structured not as defiance but as a patient procedural explanation, was the pivot point. Every person who has studied this incident, every military historian who has examined its logic, identifies this moment as the one in which the entire nature of the confrontation changed. Alexei had done something that very few people ever manage under conditions of extreme pressure. He had separated the person from the principle. He was not refusing Zhukov. He was maintaining the gate. The distinction sounds subtle. It was, in practice, everything. Because what Alexei understood and what his answer to the marshal's final question made explicit was that the regulation did not exist to inconvenience important people. It existed to make the concept of important irrelevant at this particular point. The checkpoint was the one place in the entire military hierarchy where rank by design and by explicit written rule was not the deciding factor. Documents were, procedure was, the duty officer's authorization was. If a private's documents were checked and a marshal's were not, then the checkpoint was not a checkpoint. It was theater. Zhukov stood at the barrier and understood this. And here's where the story becomes something more than an account of military regulations properly followed. Here's where it becomes something worth remembering, because Zhukov did not get angry. He did not shout. He did not invoke his rank in the way that smaller men, confronted with unexpectedly firm resistance, inevitably invoke their rank, loudly, repeatedly, with diminishing credibility. He did not threaten consequences. He did not instruct his aide to note the soldier's name for disciplinary follow-up. He stood at the barrier of a garrison checkpoint at 6:53 in the morning in the cold October air, and he did what a genuinely great man does when confronted with a principle properly applied. He waited. The duty officer, a young lieutenant named Voronov, who would later describe the experience of receiving the checkpoint call as one of the most terrifying moments of his military career, arrived at a run approximately 4 minutes later. He was still fastening the top button of his uniform jacket as he came around the corner of the garrison building and saw the scene before him: 3 black automobiles, engines running, a soldier standing at the barrier, and a very large, very still, very recognizable figure standing on the road outside the barrier. Voronov stopped. He looked at Alexei. Alexei looked back at him with an expression of complete professional calm. Voronov looked at the man standing outside the barrier. He recognized the face immediately. His own face went the color of chalk. "Comrade Marshal," he said, snapping to attention so forcefully that it looked almost physically painful. "Lieutenant Voronov, duty officer, my apologies for the—" "You are not late?" Zhukov said without turning to look at him. He was still watching Alexei. "Your soldier contacted you at the correct moment and for the correct reason. Grant the authorization." Voronov granted the authorization. The driver's documents were checked quickly, efficiently by Alexei with the same unvarying thoroughness he applied to everything. The barrier was raised. The 3 black automobiles pulled forward into the garrison. As the lead vehicle passed the checkpoint, its rear window was still down. Zhukov had not yet gotten back inside. He was standing beside the open car door, and he was looking at Alexei with an expression that nobody who ever hears this story quite forgets, because it was not the expression anyone expected. It was not the expression of a powerful man finally getting what he wanted, the relief of an obstacle removed. It was not the expression of irritation barely concealed behind official courtesy. Marshal Zhukov was looking at Private Alexei Petrov the way a man looks at something rare, something he had not expected to find at this particular gate, on this particular morning, in this particular form. He looked at him with something that, in another context, another century, another kind of story you might simply call recognition. One soldier recognizing another. And then the car door closed and the vehicles moved into the garrison and the gate swung shut behind them. Alexei straightened his uniform jacket. He took one slow breath. He returned to his patrol pattern. 3 steps left, 3 steps right, eyes on the approach road. The morning continued. The birch trees stood in the cold, and somewhere inside the garrison, the most powerful military man in the Soviet Union was forming a question that would change everything that happened next. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the resolution of something that could have gone very badly. It is not the silence of relief. Relief is too soft a word, too passive. It is the silence of a breath held for a long time, finally released, combined with the strange, almost disorienting sensation of realizing that the world is still intact, that the thing you feared did not happen, that the line you drew held and the sky did not fall. Alexei stood at his post and experienced exactly this silence. He did not allow himself to think about what had just occurred, not yet. He was still on duty. The gate was closed. The road was empty. His patrol pattern continued. 3 steps left, 3 steps right. Eyes on the approach road, eyes on the perimeter. The same pattern he had followed for nearly 2 years. The same pattern he had been following 73 minutes ago, before 3 black automobiles came around the bend in the birch trees and altered the geography of his life permanently. He did not know that yet, of course. He did not know that his life had been altered. He knew only that he had followed the regulation, that the proper procedure had been completed, and that the vehicles had passed through. From a purely technical standpoint, the incident was resolved. Everything that was supposed to happen had happened in the correct order for the correct reasons. What he could not yet see was what was happening inside the garrison. Marshal Zhukov's vehicle stopped in the central courtyard of the garrison, approximately 200 meters from the checkpoint. His aide was already speaking before the car had fully stopped. A rapid, professional summary of the day's inspection itinerary, the names of the garrison's commanding officers, the key metrics the marshal had requested reviewed. Zhukov listened to none of it. He was thinking about the soldier at the gate. This was not for Zhukov an unusual experience. He had a habit, documented by multiple aides and associates across decades of his career, of fixing his attention on unexpected things during inspection tours, a detail out of place, a discrepancy in a report, a face in a formation that didn't fit the surrounding pattern. He had built his reputation as a military commander partly on this habit, on the ability to look at a situation and identify the one element that everyone else was treating as background noise and understand that it was actually the signal. The soldier at the gate was the signal. He stepped out of the vehicle. His aide fell into step beside him, the garrison's commanding officer, a colonel named Polyakov, who had been informed of the marshal's arrival approximately 90 seconds ago, and had managed to appear in the courtyard with remarkable speed, slightly breathless, his uniform fully correct, presented himself with a salute that contained beneath its military precision a very considerable degree of anxiety. Zhukov acknowledged the salute without looking at him. "Colonel," he said, beginning to walk toward the garrison building, his hands clasped behind his back, "tell me about the soldier at your main checkpoint." Colonel Polyakov blinked. Of all the questions he had prepared for, inspection of facilities, review of readiness reports, assessment of officer performance, this was not one of them. "Comrade Marshal?" The checkpoint soldier, Private Young, plain face. "Who is he?" Polyakov's memory performed a rapid search. "Private Petrov, Comrade Marshal. Alexei Petrov, from Ryazan Oblast, 2nd-year service, assigned to checkpoint duty under Sergeant Gruzdev's. Has he ever made an exception?" The question landed quietly, but it had the quality of all of Zhukov's questions. It was not a casual inquiry. It was an examination. Polyakov considered carefully. "To my knowledge, no, Comrade Marshal. He has a reputation among the checkpoint staff for—" He chose his next word with visible care. "Consistency." Zhukov stopped walking. He turned to look at Polyakov for the first time since the conversation began, and the colonel experienced the full weight of those measuring eyes at close range, which was an experience that very few people found comfortable. "Consistency," Zhukov repeated. He seemed to be tasting the word. evaluating it, then so quietly that Polyakov was not entirely certain he had heard correctly. Good. He resumed walking. What happened next took place in 3 stages, each separated by several hours, and together they constitute one of the most remarkable sequences in the unofficial history of Soviet military life. The first stage occurred at approximately 9 in the morning, when Alexei completed his shift and returned to the barracks. Sergeant Gruzdev was waiting for him. Gruzdev's face, which was not naturally expressive, was doing something complicated, caught between professional concern, personal pride, and a very strong desire not to show either. "Petrov," he said. "Comrade Sergeant." "I've been informed about this morning." A pause. "Yes, Comrade Sergeant." "The Marshal's inspection team will want a full written account of the incident. The precise timeline, the exact documents requested, the procedure followed. You will prepare this." "Yes, Comrade Sergeant." Gruzdev looked at him for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. Then, in a voice that was carefully neutral but contained, if you knew how to listen for it, something that was not neutral at all. "You followed the regulation correctly, Petrov, in every particular. I want that noted." He turned and walked away before Alexei could respond. Alexei began writing his account. The second stage occurred at 11:45 in the morning in Colonel Polyakov's office, which was a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor polish, and the particular institutional anxiety of a man whose career had just been subjected to scrutiny from the highest possible level. Zhukov sat across the desk from Polyakov. Between them, on the desk's surface, lay Alexei's written account, which Gruzdev had submitted within the hour. Zhukov had read it. He had read it twice. "This soldier," he said, tapping the document with one finger, "understood something that a great many officers I have commanded have never understood. Do you know what that is?" Polyakov waited. "He understood that a rule which can be set aside for important people is not a rule. It is a performance of a rule, and a performance of security is more dangerous than no security at all, because it creates the illusion of protection where none exists." He looked at the document again. He also understood, and this is rarer, that refusing a superior is not the same as disrespecting a superior. He was not rude to me. He was not hostile. He explained the regulation clearly, he applied it correctly, and he maintained it under pressure. That is not insubordination. That is exactly what this position requires. Polyakov nodded with the careful attentiveness of a man who is learning something important and is aware that he's learning it. "I want to speak with him," Zhukov said. "Bring him here." Alexei had never been inside the colonel's office before. He stood at attention in the doorway for a moment before being directed inside, and in that moment, looking at the room and at the man seated in it, he experienced something that he would later describe to his family as the strangest feeling of his life. Not fear, not exactly. More like the sensation of standing at a great height and looking down, the physical awareness of exactly how much space lies between your current position and the ground. Then he stepped inside and the door closed behind him, and he reported in the standard form. Zhukov looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Petrov." Soldiers of Alexei's rank did not sit in colonels' offices. Alexei sat. What followed was not, by the accounts of those who were later told about it, a formal military proceeding. It was something closer to a conversation. Zhukov asked where Alexei was from. He asked about his family. He asked, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, how long Alexei had been assigned to checkpoint duty, and whether he had ever found the work monotonous. Alexei answered each question directly and without embellishment. He was from Ticino, in Ryazan Oblast. His father had served in the war. He had been at the checkpoint for nearly 2 years. He did not find the work monotonous. "Why not?" Zhukov asked. Alexei thought about this for a moment. "Because the work is the same every day, but the decision to do it correctly is made fresh every day. I find that," he paused, searching for the right word, "it requires something each time." Zhukov was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This morning when you stopped my convoy, did you think about what might happen to you?" "Yes, Comrade Marshal." And I thought about it, and I decided that what might happen to me for following the regulation was less important than what might happen to the regulation if I didn't follow it. In the silence that followed this answer, Colonel Polyakov, standing near the window, stared very carefully at the wall. Zhukov leaned back in his chair, and then, in a moment that Polyakov would recount to his own family for the rest of his life, with the same sense of slightly stunned wonder each time, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov smiled. Not a polite smile, not the diplomatic expression of a superior acknowledging a subordinate's performance, a genuine smile, the kind that arrives before a person has decided to produce it, the kind that comes from somewhere specific and real. He reached into the pocket of his greatcoat. He produced a small notebook and a pen. He wrote something. He tore the page and handed it to Polyakov. Private Petrov is to receive an official commendation for exemplary performance of duty, he said. I'm also authorizing 10 days of personal leave, effective immediately upon completion of current duty obligations. This is to be recorded in his service file as a direct commendation from the Ministry of Defense. Polyakov received the paper with both hands. Zhukov stood. He looked at Alexei, who had risen to attention. Your father told you to serve honestly, Zhukov said. Alexei went very still. He had not mentioned this to anyone. It was not in his written account. He would spend years afterwards trying to understand how Zhukov had known. The most likely explanation, that a man who had spent his life reading soldiers had simply recognized in Alexei's manner and his answers the unmistakable signature of someone who had been raised by a particular kind of father, was probably correct, but it never stopped feeling to Alexei like something beyond explanation. Yes, Comrade Marshal, he said. Zhukov looked at him for one more moment. Tell him, the Marshal said quietly, that he did his job. He turned to Polyakov. His voice resumed its full official register. The warmth folded back into the professional gravity like a document returned to its envelope. I will inspect the eastern barracks first, Colonel. Lead the way. He walked to the door. He opened it. He paused without turning around. Beregi to go, he said. Take care of him. Then he was gone. Alexei stood in the colonel's office and held in his hands an official document authorizing 10 days of leave and bearing the signature of the Minister of Defense of the USSR. Outside the window, the birch trees stood in the October light. The morning had become afternoon. Somewhere a bugle called the midday assembly. He looked at the document for a very long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket, exactly over his heart, though he would have said this was simply where it fit, and walked back out into the life that had, without his fully realizing it, just become a story. There is a particular mathematics to how stories travel. A story that belongs to a general, a politician, a famous name, that story travels through official channels. It appears in newspapers, in authorized biographies, in the kind of history books that are assigned to school children and then forgotten on shelves. It is preserved deliberately, curated, shaped by people who have an interest in how it is remembered. It arrives at the future wearing a uniform with its buttons polished, a story that belongs to a private, a story that begins at a checkpoint in the cold October air, in a garrison that most people have never heard of, and involving a young man from a village that does not appear on any important map. That story travels differently. It travels the way water travels, finding the lowest channels, seeping through the cracks between official things, moving horizontally through the world of ordinary people rather than vertically through the world of records and archives. It does not arrive wearing a uniform. It arrives the way all living things arrive, slightly changed by the journey, carrying the fingerprints of everyone who touched it along the way. This is how the story of Alexei Petrov began its life as a legend. He returned to his barracks on the evening of the incident as a different kind of person than he had been that morning, not internally, not in any way he could have articulated or would have wanted to claim, but in the eyes of everyone around him. The barracks had been buzzing since mid-morning. Word had moved through the garrison with the speed that only military gossip achieves, which is to say, completely within hours. with a fidelity to the emotional core of the event and a considerable looseness with the specific details. By the time Alexei walked through the barracks door that evening, the story had already acquired its first layer of embellishment. In the version circulating among the youngest conscripts, Zhukov had arrived with a convoy of 5 vehicles. In another version, the marshal had initially been quite furious and had required several minutes of persuasion. In a third version, the one that Alexei found most amusing and most baffling simultaneously, he had apparently said something brilliantly witty to Zhukov, a line so precisely devastating in its logic that the marshal had laughed out loud on the spot. Alexei had not said anything witty. He had said the regulation. But this, it turned out, was the version of events that was least interesting to the human need for story. The actual truth, a young man, 2 years of habit, 1 breath, and a sentence about documents, was somehow both more powerful and less satisfying than a legend. It required a kind of patience to appreciate. It asked you to understand that the most extraordinary things are sometimes made entirely of ordinary materials, and that this is what makes them extraordinary. Some people understood this. Some people needed the witty line. The legend accommodated both. Sergeant Gruzdev came to find Alexei that evening after mess as the barracks settled into its nighttime routine of quiet card games, letter writing, and the particular melancholy that overtakes young men far from home when the day's activity stops and the distance to everything they love becomes briefly, sharply present. He sat on the edge of Alexei's bunk with the unself-conscious ease of a man who has slept in barracks his entire adult life and considers a bunk frame a perfectly acceptable chair. "Gruzdev," Alexei said. He was writing a letter to his father. "Petrov." The sergeant was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. He looked at the 10-day leave authorization that was folded on the small shelf above Alexei's bunk. He looked at his hands. "You know what you did today." "I followed the regulation, Comrade Sergeant." "Yes," Gruzdev nodded slowly. "And you should know, because I am telling you now, and I will not say it again, that following the regulation today, with that particular convoy and that particular face in the window, required something that most men don't have." He paused. "Not courage exactly. Something quieter than courage, something more durable." Alexei looked at him. "Guard it," Gruzdev said. "Whatever it is that made you stand there and say what you said, keep it exactly as it is. Don't let the story that people are already telling about you tonight replace the actual thing inside you." He stood up from the bunk, straightened his jacket with the habitual efficiency of a man who has been straightening jackets since before Alexei was born. "The story will grow. Stories always grow. The thing that made it happen, that stays exactly the same size. Don't let one replace the other." He walked away without waiting for a response. Alexei returned to his letter. He wrote to his father for a long time that night. The next morning changed everything. Again, at 0700 hours, the entire garrison was assembled on the parade ground, all units, all ranks in full formation in a manner that was not scheduled and for which no prior notice had been given. Colonel Polyakov stood at the front, and behind him, in a posture so naturally commanding that the entire parade ground seemed to reorganize itself around his presence, stood Marshal Zhukov. Zhukov had returned. This was not part of any normal inspection protocol. Zhukov's scheduled inspection had concluded the previous afternoon. He had no official reason to be standing on this parade ground at 0700 on this particular morning. The garrison's officers, lined up in their formation, understood this, and the understanding registered on their faces with varying degrees of composure. Zhukov walked to the front of the formation. He looked at the assembled soldiers. Hundreds of faces in the pale morning light, breath condensing in the cold air, the kind of absolute stillness that only a military formation can produce, every person holding themselves in a state of heightened attention. He spoke without preamble. "Yesterday morning," he said, "I arrived at the main checkpoint of this garrison without advance notice. The duty soldier at that checkpoint stopped my convoy and required the presentation of proper documentation before granting passage. He required this of me in the same manner and with the same thoroughness that he requires it of every vehicle that passes through that gate. The silence of the formation was complete. He did not recognize an exception for my rank. He did not recognize an exception for my vehicles. He did not recognize an exception for the number of stars on my coat. A pause. Because there are no such exceptions in the regulation, and he understood, with a clarity that I common to every officer standing in this formation, that a regulation with exceptions is not a regulation. It is a convenience, and convenience is not a foundation for military discipline or military security. He paused again. His eyes moved across the formation, and several people later reported the distinct sensation, even standing 50 meters away, of being personally looked at. "Private Petrov," he said, "front and center." Alexei marched out of the formation and came to attention before the marshal. Zhukov walked toward him. He stopped at a distance of approximately 1 meter. He looked at Alexei for a moment, with that same expression from the previous afternoon. The recognition, the appraisal, the quality of genuine attention. Then he spoke loudly enough for the entire formation to hear. "Private Petrov has demonstrated exemplary performance of military duty. He has shown that the strength of a rule lies not in who enforces it, but in the consistency with which it is enforced. He is, in every respect that matters, a model soldier." He turned slightly, his voice carrying to the full formation. "I am authorizing 30 days of personal leave for Private Petrov, effective today." 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then, beginning at the front of the formation and spreading backward like a wave moving through water, something extraordinary occurred, something that did not normally happen at Soviet military formations during official proceedings, something that was, technically, not prescribed by any regulation. The soldiers began to applaud, not the officers. They held their positions. But the conscripts, the privates, the young men from villages like Tichino, who had arrived at this garrison with their father's 2-word advice and their mother's packed lunches and their complete uncertainty about what the next 2 years would ask of them. They applauded, not loudly, not chaotically, but steadily and genuinely, and with the unmistakable quality of people recognizing something they had needed to see. Zhukov did not silence them. He looked at Alexei. Alexei stood at attention, looking straight ahead, in the correct position, in the correct posture, exactly as the regulation specified. His face was completely composed, but the letter he had written to his father the night before was folded in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket, and his father's 2 words were present in him the way the correct answer is present in a person who has just been asked the right question. Serve honestly. He had. He did. Alexei left the garrison on leave 3 days later after completing the administrative requirements and handing over his checkpoint responsibilities to his relief. Sergeant Gruzdev shook his hand at the gate, the same gate where, 72 hours earlier, history had decided to introduce itself. He shook it with both hands briefly and said nothing. He didn't need to. Alexei went home to Tichino. The train journey took 11 hours. He spent most of it looking out the window at the landscape. The flat central Russian plain, the birch forest, the small stations with their hand-painted signs, the women on platforms selling boiled potatoes wrapped in newspaper. The world outside the window was completely ordinary. It had not changed. It did not know about checkpoints or marshals or 30-day leaves or parade ground applause. He arrived at Tichino station at 5 in the morning. His father was waiting on the platform. Nikolai Petrov was not a man given to demonstrations of feeling. He stood at the edge of the platform with his hands at his sides and his face in its usual configuration of quiet, weathered steadiness. He looked at his son getting off the train. He looked at the leave papers in his son's hand. He did not ask questions. They walked home together in the early morning cold, through the village that smelled of wood smoke and frozen earth and the particular stillness of a place that has been sleeping for hours and has not yet decided to wake. When they reached the house, before they went inside, Alexei told his father what had happened. all of it. The convoy, the window, the 3 refusals, the office, the smile, the leave authorization, the parade ground. He told it plainly, without drama, the way his father had always told things. In short, factual sentences, like a man filing a report. His father listened without interruption. When Alexei finished, there was a silence of perhaps 20 seconds. Then Nikolai Petrov put his hand on his son's shoulder. He gripped it once firmly, the way a man holds something he has been waiting a long time to hold. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The 2 words had already been said years ago on a front step, in the blue light of a late summer evening. Everything that had happened since was simply those 2 words lived out in the world. They went inside. The story did not stay in Ticino. In the months following Alexei's return to service and eventual demobilization, the incident at the checkpoint spread through the military networks of the Western Military District, the way all compelling true stories spread, organically, irresistibly, gathering momentum with each retelling. Officers told it to officers. Sergeants told it to conscripts. It was used in training contexts, referenced in discussions of checkpoint protocol, cited by commanders who wanted to make a specific point about the relationship between regulations and rank. Each version carried the same essential core: the young soldier, the marshal's convoy, the 3 refusals, the smile, even as the surrounding details shifted and evolved. In some versions, Alexei was from Moscow. In others, he was from Siberia. In some versions, there were as many as 7 vehicles in the convoy. In one version that circulated specifically among checkpoint personnel, Alexei had reportedly memorized the entire garrison regulation manual and could recite any section from memory. None of these additions were true. None of them mattered, because what the story was doing, what it had always been doing, from the moment Gruzdev heard it and Polyakov told it and Zhukov himself repeated it, to at least 3 different officers during the remainder of that inspection tour, was not transmitting facts. It was transmitting a standard, a picture of what a soldier could be if a soldier understood what the word soldier actually meant. Alexei himself, after his demobilization, returned to civilian life with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had never particularly wanted to be famous. He worked, he married, he raised children who were, by all accounts, raised with the same quiet architecture of principle that he had brought from his father's table and carried through his military service and returned home with intact. He told the story to his children when they were old enough to understand it. He told it to his grandchildren later, when they sat with him in the evenings and asked him to tell them something real. He told it always in the same way, plainly, without embellishment, without the witty line that the legend had invented for him. Just the regulation, the 3 refusals, the smile, the leave papers, the train home, his father's hand on his shoulder in the cold morning air, his grandchildren who had grown up in a different Soviet Union, a different Russia, a world that had moved on in countless ways from the gray garrison mornings of 1953, would listen to this story with the particular quality of attention that children give to things they instinctively understand are important before they can fully articulate why. They understood even then that their grandfather was not telling them a story about a checkpoint. He was telling them a story about what it costs to remain who you are, and how sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the world looks at you when you have paid that cost and recognizes what you've done and says, "You did your job. We have arrived at the end of this account. The vehicles have passed through the gate. The marshal has smiled. The soldier has gone home. The legend has done what legends do, spread, mutated, outlived the people who created it, and arrived here in this moment in front of you. And now we need to talk about what it means, not what it meant to Alexei, not what it meant to Zhukov. What it means to anyone alive today who has ever stood, metaphorically, practically, professionally, personally, at a gate with a rule in their hands and a very important person demanding to be let through without the proper documentation. Because here's the truth that this story has been building toward from its very first sentence, from that cold October morning and those 3 black automobiles and that single steady voice saying, "I am required to ask for your documents." The gate is not about the gate. Let us begin with the simplest question this story raises, because it is the question that every person who hears this account asks first, usually within the first 30 seconds of hearing it. What would you have done? Think about it honestly. Not the version of yourself that you present to other people. Not the version of yourself that you imagine in calm, unhurried moments when the stakes are hypothetical and comfortable. The actual version of yourself, tired in the cold, on duty since 5 in the morning, holding a regulation in one hand and the living embodiment of supreme institutional power in the other. The window comes down, you see the face. What do? Most people, if they are honest, know the answer. Most people open the gate, not because they are cowards, not because they are bad people, not because they have no principles, but because the pressure of that moment, the physical reality of that face, those stars, that car, that silence, is not abstract. It is immediate. It is present in the body, in the chest, in the hands. And the regulation, by contrast, is a piece of paper in a binder somewhere, written by people who are not here, applying to situations that were imagined in the abstract rather than lived in the specific. The regulation feels small in that moment. The face feels enormous, and so the gate opens. But here's what Alexei understood, and what his father had understood before him, and what every person who has ever maintained a principle under genuine pressure has had to understand for themselves, because it cannot be borrowed or inherited, only discovered. The regulation does not exist for ordinary moments. Regulations do not need enforcement when the person asking to be let through is a supply truck driver with the correct paperwork in the correct order, showing up at the correct time. That situation enforces itself. No courage is required, no decision is made. The procedure flows as designed, frictionless, automatic. The regulation exists entirely and only for the extraordinary moment, for the moment when the face in the window is not a truck driver's face, for the moment when the voice asking to be let through carries the weight of rank, history, reputation, and power. The regulation was written precisely because that moment would eventually arrive. At this gate or another gate, in this decade or another decade. And when it arrived, whoever was standing at the post needed to know, without ambiguity, without negotiation, without the possibility of being persuaded by the scale of what stood before them, exactly what to do. The regulation is a preparation for the hardest case. If it does not hold in the hardest case, it holds in no case. If it can be set aside for marshals, it can be set aside for colonels. If it can be set aside for colonels, it can be set aside for majors. If for majors, then for anyone who is sufficiently intimidating or sufficiently charming or sufficiently connected to someone the guard does not want to offend. And at that point, the point where the decision belongs entirely to whoever happens to be standing at the gate, governed by nothing more reliable than their own judgment about who deserves an exception, there is no longer a checkpoint. There is a person standing at a gate making individual decisions about individual faces. That is not security. That is social navigation. And the difference between the two is not bureaucratic. It is not procedural. It is not a technicality. It is the difference between a world that has rules and a world that has hierarchies dressed up as rules. Now let us talk about Zhukov, because this story is not only about Alexei, it is equally about what Georgy Zhukov did in the moments after his window came down, and a 21-year-old private from a village no one has heard of looked him in the face and said no. Zhukov could have done many things. He had, in the most literal possible sense, every instrument of institutional power available to him that a human being in a modern state can possess. He could have invoked his rank. He could have ordered consequences. He could have made one phone call that would have resulted in Alexei's morning becoming very different and very difficult. He did none of these things. He waited. He provided his documents. He allowed the procedure to complete. And then he went inside and told the garrison's commanding officer that the soldier at the gate was exactly the kind of soldier the Soviet military needed more of. Why? Not because Zhukov was a saint. He was not. His biography is complex, and his record contains chapters that are far from simple. But on this particular morning, in this particular courtyard, standing before a young man who had just refused him 3 times with perfect composure and complete procedural correctness, Zhukov demonstrated the quality that separates genuinely great leaders from merely powerful ones. He recognized that he was wrong, not wrong to arrive at the garrison, not wrong in any moral sense, but wrong in the specific, practical, institutional sense that the regulation existed for a reason, and the reason it existed was precisely this situation, and if he had been waved through simply because of the stars on his coat, the regulation would have been quietly, permanently undermined, not by any official decree, not by any formal revision, but by the simple fact of its having been set aside once at this gate by this soldier in the presence of this face. Zhukov understood that if he accepted the exception, he was destroying the rule, and a marshal who destroys rules with his presence, even inadvertently, even by simply allowing them to yield to his gravity, is not building an army. He's building a culture of managed exceptions where things work correctly only when no one sufficiently important is watching. He chose the rule. He chose Alexei. There is a question that historians and archivists raise when this story is discussed, and it would be dishonest not to name it here in this final part after everything that has been said. The question is simply this: did this happen exactly as described? The honest answer is that the documentary record is incomplete. The garrison logs from that period have been partially preserved and partially lost. The written commendation exists, or a document matching its description exists in a regional military archive. Sergeant Gruzdev's unpublished memoir mentions the incident in terms consistent with the account that has been passed down. Multiple former soldiers who served in the Western Military District during that period have offered accounts that corroborate the essential elements. But the specific dialogue, the exact sequence of the 3 refusals, Zhukov's precise words in Polyakov's office, these come to us through the channel that most human truth travels through: memory, retelling, the long game of oral transmission across decades. And here's the answer that this genre, the genre of documentary legend, the genre of publicistic investigation, has always given to that question, because it is the only honest answer available. It does not matter, not in the way you might think it matters. If every detail of this account is precisely accurate, then what we have is a remarkable historical event. If some details have grown in the telling, if the convoy had 2 vehicles rather than 3, if Zhukov's smile was smaller than described, if the parade ground applause was quieter, then what we have is something equally valuable, a story that a community of people across generations chose to tell because it contained a truth they needed to preserve. Communities do not preserve stories by accident. They preserve stories that answer questions they are always asking themselves, and the question this story answers, the question it has always answered in every barracks and kitchen table and grandchild's bedtime where it has ever been told, is the oldest question that institutions and individuals ask each other. When the rule becomes inconvenient, do we keep it? Alexei's answer was yes. And the fact that we are still telling his story, that you are here at the end of this account, having traveled from a cold October morning at a garrison checkpoint all the way to this moment, suggests that we are still asking the question, which means the answer is still needed. Marshal Zhukov died on the 18th of June, 1974. He was 77 years old. He was buried with full state honors at the Kremlin Wall. His legacy is officially enormous and unofficially complicated, the way the legacies of all genuinely significant historical figures tend to be. Alexei Petrov. If we are to be precise about the boundary between documented history and living legend, is known to us through the account, through the archive fragment, through Gruzdev's memoir, through the testimony of former soldiers, through the story that his grandchildren carry. He was an ordinary man. He was, in the most important possible sense, an extraordinary one. Not because he was heroic, not because he was brilliant, not because he did something that required exceptional talent or exceptional courage in the conventional military sense of that word. but because on one October morning when everything in the situation was telling him to make an exception, he chose not to. He chose the rule. He chose it not for a reward. He did not know there would be a reward. He chose it not for an audience. The birch trees in the cold air were not watching with any particular interest. He chose it because his father had told him to serve honestly, and honest service, in that moment, meant exactly one thing. The rule applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. Perhaps Alexei never existed exactly as described. Perhaps the story has been shaped and polished by decades of retelling until the original event is somewhere underneath the legend, like a stone under clear water, present, visible, but refracted. Perhaps. But here's what's certainly true. The world needs this story. It needs the image of a young man standing at a gate with nothing but a regulation and 2 words his father gave him, looking at the most powerful face he has ever seen and not opening the gate. Because every one of us, at some point in our lives, in some form, at some gate, will face a version of that moment, a face that expects the exception, a silence that asks you to yield. A situation in which the easiest, most socially intelligent, most career-preserving decision is to simply raise the barrier and let the important person through and tell yourself that the regulation was designed for lesser cases. And in that moment, which will arrive without announcement, without preparation, without the documentary narrator's measured voice to tell you that this is the part that matters, you will have to decide whether the rule means something, or whether it means something only when it's convenient. Alexei decided. The gate held, the legend lives, and the only question this story has ever been asking, remains exactly where it has always been, on your side of the barrier.